wind was the first thing Elara noticed about Scotland. It wasn't a mere draught or a stiff breeze. It was a physical presence, a vast, invisible hand sweeping the moorlands of Skye, smelling of brine, wet peat, and untold ages of undisturbed stone. It was a clean, sharp scent that cut through the stale city air still clinging to her coat, and it felt like a powerful, necessary expulsion of her past. She had arrived seeking emptiness. After a dizzying, disastrous year in finance and a relationship that had dissolved into mutual exhaustion, she craved only the silence of ancient, indifferent hills. She wanted to stand somewhere so magnificent, so wholly consumed by its own history, that her own small, messy life would finally shrink into its proper, insignificant scale. The queraying delivered. The trail had long since vanished beneath her clumsy hiking boots, leaving her to navigate the undulating sea of purple and green heather. A fine, persistent mist, known locally as har, rolled in from the jagged peaks, muffling the cries of unseen birds and turning the world into a canvas of shifting grey and emerald. She found herself moving by instinct alone, drawn toward a dark silhouette that promised shelter, or perhaps just a definitive end to this stretch of her journey. The silhouette resolved into a cluster of standing stones, not an established tourist site, but something more primal and forgotten, the remnants of a long-dead croft, the stones now forming a natural, silent amphitheatre around a single, massive boulder. It was here, in this pocket of quiet, shielded momentarily from the wind, that she saw him. He wasn't an apparition, though for a moment, the way he blended into the rock and peat, she thought he might be. He was kneeling beside a low, sheltered fire, tending to a pot that hung from a simple tripod. He was a man of the mountains, rugged tweed jacket, thick, worn leather boots, and a heavy wool kilt, the tartan a deep muted blue and forest green. His hair was the colour of wet bracken, dark gold with streaks of sun, and tied back loosely, revealing a stark, angular profile. Elara hesitated, feeling intrusive, yet the damp cold had begun to seep into her bones, making retreat impossible. She cleared her throat, and the small sound seemed deafening in the vast, mist-hushed space. He turned. His eyes were the immediate shocking thing, the colour of warm amber, piercing and direct, and carrying a steady, almost frightening intensity. They studied her, not with suspicion, but with a profound, quiet assessment that seemed to look right through her city clothes and straight into the core of her weariness. "You're lost," he stated, his voice a low, resonant baritone, thick with the lilt of the north. It was not a question. "I was finding my way," she replied, her own voice shaky from the cold and the unexpected encounter. The path disappeared. He rose in one fluid motion. He was easily 6'4", carrying the kind of lean, powerful muscle that comes not from a gym, but from heavy, daily physical labor. He gestured toward the fire. "It's a fool's path, this moor. You'll have to wait for the fog to lift, or you'll walk right into the sea. Come warm yourself, Elara." The use of her name, which she hadn't given, jolted her. "How did you know my name?" A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. "The small things travel on the wind here. You told the innkeeper in Portree you were looking for silence. Elara is not a silent name. I'm Cian." She moved toward the heat, her boots crunching softly on the stones. He was right. The fire was salvation. It was intimate, built inside the shelter of a ruined stone wall, the peat smoke sweet and earthy. She sat on a worn saddle blanket he offered, suddenly realizing how long she had been shivering. "Are you staying out here?" she asked, watching the easy competence of his hands as he stirred the pot. "I live on the land, Human," he said simply, "a few miles north overlooking the loch. I come here when the sheep need moving or when the air needs clearing." He met her eyes again, and the directness of his gaze felt like a sudden spike of temperature. "And sometimes when people need finding." He handed her a tin cup filled with a rich, smoky broth. She sipped it gratefully, the flavor immediate and fortifying. They spoke little over the next hour, only necessary, functional words about the weather and the difficulty of the terrain. Yet the silence that settled between them was not awkward. It was charged, heavy with unspoken curiosity and a growing magnetic awareness. Elara found herself cataloguing him with a sudden alarming attentiveness, the lines radiating from the corners of his eyes, earned by sun and wind, the slight roughness of his hands, scarred and capable, the way the heavy wool of the kilt fell over the powerful musculature of his thighs when he knelt, a vision of uncompromising, wild masculinity that seemed centuries removed from the tailored suits and soft hands she was used to. As the sun began its slow, glacial descent behind the clouds, casting the entire valley in shades of bruised amethyst, the mist began to thin. "It's safe to walk now," Cian said, draining his cup. "I'll walk you to the track. It's too late to risk the shortcut." The walk back was where the true connection began to forge. The air was clear and sharp, and the vastness of the landscape opened up around them. They talked about the land, the history etched into the rock, the harsh poetry of the clan feuds, the resilience of the tiny purple moss. Cian spoke with a passionate reverence, revealing the complexity beneath his rugged exterior. He wasn't just a shepherd or a reclusive local. He was a scholar of the land, a keeper of its secrets. "You came here for silence," he reminded her as they reached the faint gravel track. "Have you found it?" Elara looked up at him. The last light caught the gold in his hair. "I found the noise of the city finally leaving me," she admitted. "But the silence here, it feels like it's waiting for something to fill it." Cian took a step closer. The proximity was immediate and potent. He smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something uniquely clean and male. "Sometimes," he murmured, his voice dropping low, "it is waiting for a certain sound." He lifted his hand, his thumb lightly brushing the sharp edge of her jawline. The touch was feather-light, yet it sent a seismic shift through her entire body. Every nerve ending flared to life, extinguishing the cold and the exhaustion in a sudden, powerful rush of heat. It was the first truly honest, physical sensation she had felt in months. He didn't move to kiss her immediately. Instead, he simply looked at her, his amber eyes burning with a question that needed no words. He was testing the boundaries, giving her every chance to retreat. But the desire to lean into that calloused touch, to close the infinitesimal gap between them, was overwhelming. When his lips finally met hers, the kiss was slow, deliberate and devastating. It was not the hurried, frantic energy of a young man, but the confident, measured pace of a man who knew what he wanted and how to take his time claiming it. The scent of peat and wool seemed to envelop her. His mouth was firm, warm, and tasted faintly of the smoky broth and the clean, cold air. The kiss deepened, drawing a low, involuntary sound from her throat. His hand shifted, moving to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling roughly in her hair, pulling her closer against the scratchy wool of his tweed. The contrast, the roughness of his clothes and the unexpected tenderness of his mouth, was intoxicating. She felt a deep, unfamiliar ache awaken, a yearning that had nothing to do with loneliness and everything to do with this man, this elemental place. He pulled back, his breathing uneven. He rested his forehead against hers, their eyes closed. "The road is here," he whispered, his voice husky. "The safety of the path. You must take it now." The sudden cessation was a shock, a physical rejection that stung. But she knew instinctively that this man was driven by deep currents she didn't yet understand. She straightened, gathering her frayed dignity. "Will I see you again, Cian?" He stepped back fully, the distance immediately too vast. "If the silence you found allows it," he said, his expression once again unreadable. "Ask the wind. It knows my tracks better than I do." And then, with a simple nod, he turned and vanished into the gathering twilight, leaving her standing alone on the track, her lips tingling and her world feeling suddenly, wonderfully rearranged. The next few days were a blur of restless wandering. Elara stayed at the small inn in Portray, but the picturesque town felt suffocating. Her thoughts were a constant, chaotic loop of Cian, his eyes, the weight of his hand, the promise of that powerful, unfinished kiss. The sensible part of her, the former financial analyst, told her to leave. This was a fantasy born of solitude and dramatic scenery. The other part, the part that had craved truth and sensation, refused to move. On the fourth day, defying all logic, she hiked back to the moor, guided not by a map, but by the memory of the light and the scent of the peat fire. She didn't find the stone circle, but she found a note tucked beneath a cairn she vaguely remembered passing. It was a single heavy sheet of paper, held down by a smooth, dark stone. Written in bold, sweeping script was a single line: "Follow the river where the heather turns to fern." The instruction was cryptic, yet it felt like a command. With a renewed sense of purpose, she set off, navigating down into a hidden glen where the vegetation shifted dramatically. After an arduous hour of climbing and scrambling, she heard the unmistakable roar of falling water. She emerged into a secluded, impossibly beautiful gorge. A high waterfall spilled into a dark, swirling pool, and nestled beside the water, built seamlessly into the side of the hill with a roof of thick, dark turf, was a small stone-built bothy. A small shelter. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney. Cian was waiting in the doorway. He was chopping wood, shirtless, the muscle in his back and shoulders moving beneath sun-kissed skin. The sight of him was an immediate, stunning assault on her senses. The sheer physicality of the man, the concentration of his movements, the simple masculine grace of his labor, it stopped her breath. He stopped, resting the axe head against the chopping block, and wiped his brow with the back of his wrist, leaving a faint streak of charcoal smudge. The corner of his mouth lifted in that private, knowing half-smile. "You're far from the path again, Elara," he said. "I was following instructions." "Did the instruction tell you to bring a backpack of supplies and a look in your eyes that says you never want to leave?" She dropped her pack with a thump. "Yes, precisely." He laughed then, a deep, rich sound that seemed to chase the echoes in the gorge. "Come in, it's small but it's dry, and I have whiskey that will burn the cold right out of you." The bothy was tiny, immaculate, and smelled strongly of peat, beeswax, and dried herbs. It contained a simple cot, a small stove, a table, and a wall of worn books. As the door closed behind her, shutting out the vast, cold landscape, the small space became immediately intimate. They sat close across the small table, sharing the deep, complex heat of a single malt. The atmosphere was radically different from their first meeting. The urgency of the mist was gone, replaced by a slow, burning anticipation. "Why did you stop that night, Cian?" she asked, the question fueled by the whisky and the need for clarity. He traced the rim of his glass with a thoughtful finger. "Because that was the land claiming you. I didn't want you to confuse the sudden thrill of escape with the slow fire of desire. I needed you to choose to find me again. And you did. And what now?" He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table, their faces mere inches apart. His eyes held hers unwavering. "Now the land has brought you to my hearth, and tonight, Elara, the fire is for us." The world narrowed to the small, intense circle of the firelight. The air crackled with unspoken agreement. This time, when he reached for her, there was no hesitation, no question. The touch was explosive, a release of the tension that had been building for days. He didn't rush, but his movements were charged with a deep, focused energy. He stood and drew her up against his chest, the heavy wool of his kilt brushing against her denim. His mouth was demanding now, his hands sliding beneath her jacket, mapping the curve of her waist, the slight tremor in her skin. He broke the kiss, burying his face in the curve of her neck, his breath hot against her cold skin. He lifted her easily, carrying her the few steps to the cot, the movement unhurried and confident. He stood over her, backlit by the firelight, undoing the leather belt of his kilt. The movement was primal, compelling. His gaze never left hers, the amber heat in his eyes igniting a corresponding heat within her. "Elara," he murmured, his voice thick. "There is no rush. There is only this moment, and the rain starting on the turf roof." He shed the heavy cloth and leather. She reached up, pulling him down to her, finally reaching for the warmth of his skin she had dreamed of, the smooth, powerful curve of his shoulders, the clean scent of his neck. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the sound of the waterfall and the rising rhythm of their breath. He was a man who knew the slow, sustaining pleasure of effort. He worked his way through the layers of her clothes with a patient intensity that was more intoxicating than any feverish rush. His touch was both rough and gentle, a dialogue between the calloused strength of his hands and the vulnerability of her skin. Every lingering exploration, every charged glance was a promise that amplified the deep, building tension. He moved with the profound, quiet awareness of a creature of the wild, attuned to every subtle shift in her body, every sound she made. When his mouth found the sensitive curve of her neck and shoulder, she arched against him, the sharp intake of her breath filling the small space. His hands were everywhere, demanding and tender, stoking the fire until her mind was a dizzy, single focus of raw sensation. She dug her fingers into the taut, warm muscle of his back, feeling the tremor of his own restrained passion. It was a complete surrender to the elemental pull of the man and the wild, ancient place. They woke to the sound of rain on the turf and the faint grey light filtering through the small window. Elara felt utterly renewed, not rested, but fundamentally rewired. She watched Cian sleep for a long time, cataloguing the relaxed lines of his face, the way his hair fell across the pillow. The man who was once a mystical shadow was now warm, solid, and wonderfully real beside her. As the sun finally broke through the clouds, painting the glen in brilliant, saturated green, Cian was gone. Panic, the cold, familiar clutch of loneliness, threatened to overwhelm her. But then she saw the small earthenware mug and the steaming pot of porridge on the table. He returned an hour later, wrapped in a blanket, his hair damp from the waterfall. He carried a handful of vibrant purple heather and a look of sober resolution. "I have something to tell you, Elara," he said, sitting beside her. "Something I held back because I didn't want to be the reason you stayed. I wanted it to be the land, or the silence, or your own need." She waited, bracing herself for the inevitable heartbreak, the wife, the commitment, the reason he must stay and she must go. "The secret of the bothy," he began, his voice low. "I am not merely a shepherd. I work for a trust that preserves this land. I'm here to assess a massive land purchase. It's an American corporation that wants to turn this entire section of Skye into a luxury resort. I have been fighting it for 2 years. They have a final meeting next week in Edinburgh, and if I can't produce an investor who will match their offer and commit to true conservation, it will be lost." He looked straight at her. "The bothy is my temporary base. I was leaving tomorrow. I didn't tell you because I couldn't bear the thought of tainting this connection with a desperate plea for help." Elara felt the familiar whir of her old life kick back in, the numbers, the strategy, the ruthlessness of the market. She was a financial analyst. She knew investors. "Wait," she said, scrambling off the cot. "The corporation, the offer, the date. Give me the details. I know people. I know the language. I came here to lose my life, Cian. But what if I'm supposed to use what I learned in that life to save yours?" Over the next few days, the bothy transformed. The romance did not vanish, but it deepened, intertwined with shared purpose. Elara used her laptop, powered by a small solar panel he owned, while Cian spread out vast, hand-drawn maps of the protected areas. Their work was fueled by strong coffee and the occasional intense burst of passion when a breakthrough was made, or when the weight of the task became too heavy to ignore. Elara contacted her most reliable and ethically minded former mentor in London, pitching the conservation project not as a charity case but as a unique, sustainable, long-term investment in heritage tourism and eco-development. She provided the cold, hard numbers that backed Cian's passionate plea for preservation. The meeting in Edinburgh was a blur of high-powered, ruthless negotiation. Elara, dressed in a sharp suit that felt strange after days of fleece and wool, was fierce. She stood beside a proud, resolute Cian, wielding spreadsheets like swords, arguing the ecological value versus the short-term profit. She secured a small, crucial block of investment from her mentor's firm, enough to leverage a matching fund from a conservation group. They won. A year later, Elara stood on the same moor, her feet firmly planted on the damp, resilient earth. The wind still swept around her, but now it felt like an old friend welcoming her home. The bothy was now the headquarters for the Skye Heritage Trust, small, perfectly organized, and bustling with occasional volunteers. Elara, having liquidated her old life, was the Trust's director of development. She wore tweed now, and her hands were no longer soft. She walked towards the stone circle where they had first met. Cian was there, But he wasn't alone. He was kneeling, not tending a fire, but gently setting a small circular stone into the turf, planting a root of brilliant purple heather beside it. He looked up, his amber eyes catching the sunlight, still intense, still utterly focused on her. "This one is rooted, Elara," he said, his voice echoing the commitment in his gaze. "It will hold the hill now." She dropped beside him, leaning into the warmth of his strong, familiar body. "Just like you, my Highland warrior, you've let the roots take hold." He put his arm around her, pulling her close, resting his cheek against her hair. "I came here to find silence," she mused, breathing in the scent of his skin and the peat. "I found the noise of a new life, a new passion, and the most magnificent noise of all, yours." He turned her face to his lips finding hers with the same slow, measured confidence of their first true kiss. It was a promise of permanence, steeped in the deep magic of the land. "Welcome home, Elara," he whispered against her mouth. "We have all the time in the world now and a lifetime of moorland to tend.